The morning sun peeked through the bedroom curtains as the alarm buzzed at exactly 5:30 a.m. Judge Thompson rolled over, silencing the familiar sound that had started her days for the past 12 years. She didn't need the alarm anymore. Her body clock was so used to this routine that she often woke up minutes before it went off. This morning felt different, though. Maybe it was the way the autumn breeze carried the scent of rain through her slightly open window, or perhaps it was that nagging feeling about the big case she'd be presiding over later that day. Whatever it was, she took a few extra moments in bed, something she rarely allowed herself. Getting up, she walked over to her closet, where her judge's robe hung perfectly pressed. Next to it were the crisp business suits she wore beneath, a collection built over years of climbing the legal ladder. Each piece told its own story of determination, late nights, and countless hours proving herself in a system that didn't always welcome people who looked like her. "Coffee first," she mumbled to herself, padding barefoot into her kitchen. The house was quiet except for the soft purring of her cat, who followed her around hoping for an early breakfast. The morning news played softly on her kitchen TV as she prepared her coffee just the way she liked it, strong with just a splash of cream. As the coffee maker hummed, she glanced at the family photos on her refrigerator. There was one of her parents at her law school graduation, their faces beaming with pride. They'd worked multiple jobs to put her through school, and now their daughter was one of the most respected judges in the district. Next to it was a picture from her first day on the bench. She remembered how her hands had trembled slightly as she put on her robe for the first time. Sipping her coffee, she opened her laptop to review the day's cases. The screen's glow illuminated her focused expression as she scrolled through files, making mental notes. This was her favorite part of the morning, the quiet moments before the world fully woke up, when she could think clearly about the decisions that would affect people's lives. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Good luck with today's case. Show them what our parents taught us about justice." A small smile crossed her face as she typed back a quick thank you. Family support had always been her backbone, especially on the harder days. Walking into her bathroom, she began her careful morning routine. Each movement was practiced and purposeful. The subtle makeup, the neat hairstyle, the professional attire. Everything had to be perfect. As a black female judge, she knew that appearance mattered more than it should. She'd learned early on that in her position, she couldn't just be good, she had to be exceptional. She paused at her mirror, adjusting her pearl necklace, a graduation gift from her grandmother. "You carry our hopes with you," her grandmother had said. Those words echoed in her mind every morning as she prepared to uphold the law. Gathering her briefcase, she did one final check of her papers. The weight of responsibility settled comfortably on her shoulders. It was familiar now, like an old friend. This was her calling, after all. Making sure justice was served fairly, regardless of who stood before her bench. As she picked up her car keys, she glanced at the clock, 7:15 a.m., right on schedule. The drive to the courthouse usually took 20 minutes, giving her plenty of time to settle into her chambers before the day began. Little did she know that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. She stepped out into the crisp morning air, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked to her car. The neighborhood was quiet, with just a few early joggers passing by. Some waved. They knew her as the friendly judge who always had time for a quick hello. But today, something felt off. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe just coincidence, but as she started her car, she took an extra moment to check her rearview mirror. The world was about to witness how one traffic stop could expose the deep-rooted problems still plaguing the justice system. But for now, Judge Thompson was just another professional heading to work, ready to serve her community with the fairness and dignity that had become her trademark. The morning traffic flowed smoothly as Judge Thompson drove her black sedan down the familiar route to the courthouse. She hummed along to the soft jazz playing on her car radio, mentally reviewing the cases she'd be hearing that day. The familiar buildings of downtown passed by her window, their windows catching the early morning sunlight. She checked her watch. Still plenty of time before her first hearing. That's when she noticed the flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart did a small jump, even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Years of being a judge had taught her that even the most law-abiding citizens could feel that instinctive nervousness when seeing those lights. Following procedure perfectly, Just as she'd seen thousands of times in her courtroom, she signaled and pulled over to the right, choosing a well-lit spot near a coffee shop. She turned down the radio, rolled down her window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. These were the same safety protocols she praised defendants' lawyers for teaching their clients. The police officer approached from behind, his footsteps slow and measured on the pavement. In her side mirror, she could see him, young, probably in his early 30s, with a crisp uniform and rigid posture. She noticed how his hand rested near his belt, standard procedure, but something about his stance seemed more tense than necessary. "License and registration," he demanded, without the usual greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone made her sit up straighter, her judicial instincts picking up on the unusual hostility. Still, she kept her voice steady and professional. "Of course, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" She reached slowly for her purse on the passenger seat, making sure her movements were deliberate and visible. The morning sun caught her pearl necklace, sending a brief flash of light across the car's interior. "You failed to signal a lane change back there," he said, his voice carrying an edge that seemed disproportionate to such a minor infraction, if it had happened at all. Judge Thompson was certain she used her signal, as she always did. It was as much a habit as breathing. As she handed over her license and registration, she noticed how he barely glanced at them, his eyes instead scanning her car's interior with unnecessary scrutiny. She recognized this behavior. She'd seen it described in countless testimonies in her courtroom. The thought made her stomach tighten, but she maintained her composure. "Ma'am, what's your occupation?" he asked, though her bar association card was clearly visible alongside her license. The way he said "ma'am" carried none of the respect the word was supposed to convey. "I'm a judge at the county courthouse," she replied calmly, watching his reaction. There was a slight pause, then a scoff, subtle, but unmistakable. The morning traffic continued to flow around them, commuters heading to work, unaware of the tension building in this routine traffic stop. "Right," he drawled, drawing out the word. "And I'm the president." His sarcasm was thick, unprofessional. Through her car window, she could see people in the coffee shop starting to take notice of the scene. A few had phones in their hands, though she couldn't tell if they were recording. "Officer, if you check my credentials, you'll see that I am indeed Judge Thompson. I'm actually due in court this morning, Toe." "Step out of the vehicle," he cut her off, his hand moving to his belt again. The morning sun seemed to dim as a cloud passed overhead, casting shadows across the scene. Judge Thompson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. In her years on the bench, she'd heard testimony about moments exactly like this, moments when routine stops escalated for no valid reason. She'd always listened with sympathy and concern, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The professional distance she maintained in her courtroom dissolved in the face of this raw reality. She could see the coffee shop patrons more clearly now. Several had their phones out, definitely recording. A barista stood in the doorway, concern evident on her face. Judge Thompson thought about her sister's good luck text from just an hour ago, about the cases waiting for her at the courthouse, about the thousands of times she'd heard similar stories from her bench. Taking a deep breath, she kept her voice steady and clear. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my judicial badge in my purse. It will confirm my identity." She moved with deliberate slowness, years of courtroom experience helping her maintain composure even as her heart raced. But the officer had already made up his mind about who she was, or rather, who he thought she was. His next words would transform this routine traffic stop into a story that would soon shock the entire legal community, though neither of them knew it yet. The morning sun emerged from behind the cloud, illuminating the scene once again. More cars were slowing as they passed, more phones recording, more witnesses to what was about to unfold. In her mind, Judge Thompson could already see this moment from both sides, the person experiencing it and the judge who would eventually have to evaluate similar situations from her bench. Little did the officer know that his next actions would not only change his own life, but would spark a conversation that would reach far beyond this street corner on what had started as just another ordinary morning. The tension in the air grew thicker as Judge Thompson held her judicial badge in her steady hand. Through her open car window, the sounds of the city seemed to fade away, leaving only the heavy silence between her and the officer. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement, highlighting the growing crowd of onlookers outside the coffee shop. "I don't have time for fake IDs," the officer said, his voice carrying a dismissive tone that she'd heard far too often in testimonies from her courtroom. "Step out of the vehicle now." His hand remained uncomfortably close to his belt, his stance rigid with unwarranted suspicion. Judge Thompson took a deep breath, drawing on years of courtroom experience to keep her voice steady. "Officer, I want to comply with your requests, but I need you to understand that I am a sitting judge. If you just take a moment to verify." "A judge?" he interrupted, letting out a harsh laugh that made several bystanders flinch. "Look, lady, I've heard every excuse in the book. But this is new." The way he emphasized "this one" carried layers of meaning that made her stomach tighten. She could see more phones recording now, their small red lights like tiny warning beacons. A young woman in a business suit had stopped completely, a coffee forgotten in her hand. An elderly man shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of sadness and recognition. "I appear in front of your department regularly," Judge Thompson explained, her legal training kicking in as she documented every detail of this interaction in her mind. "If you call the courthouse right now, they can confirm my identity. I'm actually due to hear a case involving one of your fellow officers this afternoon." The officer's face flickered with uncertainty for just a moment, but his pride seemed to overshadow his judgment. "Out of that car," he enunciated each word like he was speaking to a child, ignoring the growing murmurs from the crowd. Inside the coffee shop, the barista who had been watching was now on the phone, speaking urgently to someone. A delivery truck driver had pulled over, leaving his hazard lights blinking, their steady rhythm marking time like a metronome in this surreal scene. Judge Thompson thought about every similar situation she'd heard described from her bench, about every witness testimony that had started just like this. She thought about her parents' sacrifices to put her through law school, about her grandmother's pearls still gleaming at her neck, about the weight of responsibility she carried not just as a judge, but as a symbol of progress. "I'm going to reach for my phone," she announced clearly, making sure her words would be picked up by the recording devices around them. "I'm going to call the courthouse myself. You can listen to the conversation on speakerphone." Her hand moved slowly toward her purse again. "No phones." The officer snapped, his voice rising. "I said out of the vehicle. Last warning." The morning traffic had slowed to a crawl now, drivers rubbernecking to witness the scene. A city bus had stopped across the street, its passengers pressing against the windows. Judge Thompson could see their expressions: concern, anger, recognition of a scenario played out too many times before. She thought about her options, each one running through her mind like evidence in a case. She could continue to resist, knowing she was in the right. She could comply and trust that the truth would come out later. She could wait for someone from the growing crowd to intervene. But each choice carried its own risks, its own potential consequences. The pearl necklace felt heavy against her throat now, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. "You carry our hopes with you." The weight of that responsibility had never felt heavier than in this moment, as she watched the officer's patience visibly wearing thin. A cool breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, carrying with it the scent of morning coffee and the sound of distant sirens, though whether they were heading this way or not, she couldn't tell. The officer's radio crackled with routine chatter, a stark reminder of how quickly an ordinary morning had spiraled into this situation. From her years on the bench, she knew that moments like these were crossroads, points where a single decision could change everything. She had presided over countless cases where similar moments had gone terribly wrong, but she had also seen cases where wisdom and patience had prevailed. The crowd had grown larger, their presence both a comfort and a concern. They were witnesses, yes, but would their presence escalate or de-escalate this situation? The coffee shop window had become a wall of faces, phones held high, documenting every word, every gesture. Judge Thompson looked directly into the officer's eyes, seeing past the hostility to something else, insecurity, perhaps, or fear disguised as authority. In her courtroom, she had learned to read people, to understand the stories behind their actions. This officer's story was writing itself in real time, though he didn't realize it yet. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying the same authority she used in her courtroom, "what you're doing right now is going to have consequences." I am giving you one last opportunity to verify my identity through proper channels before this situation becomes something neither of us can step back from. The morning sun had risen higher now, eliminating the last shadows from the scene, as if ensuring that whatever happened next would be clearly visible to all the witnesses gathered around them. The next few moments would determine not just the outcome of this traffic stop, but potentially the course of both their lives. Time seemed to slow down as Judge Thompson carefully opened her car door. The morning air felt suddenly cold against her skin as she stepped out, her heels making a soft click against the pavement. She stood tall, her professional demeanor intact despite the humiliation of the moment. The growing crowd of onlookers held their phones steady, recording every second. "Hands where I can see them," the officer commanded, his voice carrying across the now quiet street. The coffee shop door chimed as more people stepped outside to witness the scene. A newspaper vendor across the street had stopped mid-route, his stack of papers forgotten under his arm. Judge Thompson kept her movements slow and deliberate, just as she'd advised countless defendants to do in similar situations. "I'm cooperating fully, officer," she said clearly, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in her courtroom. "But I want to state again for the record that I am a sitting judge, and this arrest is unlawful." The officer's response was to reach for his handcuffs. The metal clanked loudly in the morning air, the sound seeming to echo off the surrounding buildings. "Turn around," he ordered, apparently oblivious to or unconcerned with the dozens of cameras now recording his actions. A passing crossing guard had stopped at the corner, her orange vest bright in the morning sun, her sign lowered as she watched the scene unfold. Behind her, several parents with children had paused, their school run interrupted by this display of injustice. "Officer," Judge Thompson said, her voice steady even as she felt the cold metal close around her wrists, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing right now. This moment will have consequences." The pearls at her neck caught the sunlight, a flash of dignity in an undignified moment. More sirens could be heard in the distance now, growing closer. The crowd had swelled to fill the sidewalk, their murmurs growing louder, more insistent. A city bus had stopped completely, its passengers pressing against the windows, adding to the growing number of witnesses. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer began, reciting the Miranda rights with mechanical efficiency. The words seemed to hang in the air, their familiarity striking an ironic chord. How many times has she heard these same rights read in her courtroom? How many times has she ensured they were properly given? The smell of coffee wafted from the nearby shop, a mundane detail that seemed strangely out of place in this extraordinary moment. A barista had stepped outside, still wearing her green apron, her phone held high as she spoke urgently into it. "Yes, right outside the shop. No, you need to send someone now. They're arresting a judge." Judge Thompson felt the eyes of the crowd on her as the officer led her toward his patrol car. She walked with dignity, her head held high. Her briefcase and purse still sat in her car, the case files for today's hearings waiting patiently inside. She thought about her packed courtroom schedule, about the people waiting for their cases to be heard, about the justice that would be delayed because of this moment. The patrol car's back door opened with a heavy sound. Before ducking her head to enter, Judge Thompson turned to face the crowd, making sure her face was clearly visible to all the recording devices. She wanted every detail of this incident documented, every second preserved for what she knew would come next. "I want everyone here to remember this morning," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed street. "Remember what you're witnessing." The officer tugged at her arm, but she stood firm for just a moment longer. "This is what the system looks like when it fails." As she was guided into the back seat, she caught a glimpse of herself in the car's window reflection, her professional suit, her judge's posture, her grandmother's pearls, all now framed by the patrol car's cage. The door slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the street. Through the car's window, she could see more police vehicles arriving, their lights flashing silently in the morning sun. Officers were stepping out, looking confused at the scene before them. The crowd had grown even larger, their phones still recording, their faces showing a mix of outrage and disbelief. Inside the patrol car, Judge Thompson closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She thought about every case she'd presided over involving police conduct, every testimony she'd heard about moments like this. Now she was living it, experiencing firsthand what so many had described from her witness stand. The officer got into the driver's seat, adjusting his mirror to look back at her. For a brief moment, their eyes met in the reflection. She saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first inkling that he had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late now. The wheels had been set in motion, both literally and figuratively. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Judge Thompson watched the crowd through the window. They were already on their phones, sharing what they'd witnessed. She knew that by the time they reached the station, this story would be spreading. The truth would come out, but at what cost to the system she'd spent her life serving? The familiar buildings of her morning commute passed by the window, now seen from a completely different perspective. The courthouse where she should have been preparing for today's cases grew smaller in the distance. But even as they drove away, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as the arresting officer led Judge Thompson through the front doors. The morning shift was in full swing, with officers and staff moving about their routine duties. But as they walked in, the usual hum of activity began to slow, then stop altogether, like a wave of recognition spreading through the room. A desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. His eyes widened as he recognized the woman in handcuffs. "Wait," he said, rising from his chair. "Isn't that Judge Thompson?" Another officer stepped forward, his face draining of color. What in the world? He had testified in her courtroom just last week, presenting evidence in a robbery case. The sight of her in handcuffs seemed to short-circuit his brain. The arresting officer, still holding Judge Thompson's arm, began to sense that something was very wrong. The atmosphere in the station had changed dramatically, with all eyes now fixed on them. Phones were being lowered, conversations dying mid-sentence, and faces showing expressions ranging from shock to horror. "Someone get the captain," a voice called out from somewhere in the room. The words seemed to break a spell, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. The desk sergeant was already on his phone, speaking in urgent whispers. Two senior officers were hurrying down the hallway, their faces grave. Judge Thompson stood quietly, her dignity intact despite the handcuffs. She noticed how the younger officers were looking at her with a mix of respect and embarrassment, many of them having appeared before her bench during their testimony training. The pearl necklace her grandmother gave her caught the harsh fluorescent light, a reminder of grace under pressure. The station doors burst open again as more officers rushed in, many of them still holding their phones showing the viral videos that were already spreading across social media. "That's her. That's the judge from the videos," one of them exclaimed, pointing at his screen then at Judge Thompson. The arresting officer's face had gone from confident to confused to horrified in the span of minutes. His hand, still holding Judge Thompson's arm, began to tremble slightly. He looked around the room, seeming to shrink under the collective stare of his colleagues. "Someone get these cuffs off her right now." The captain's voice boomed through the station as he emerged from his office, his face a storm cloud of anger and disbelief. He had worked with Judge Thompson on numerous cases, respected her fairness in the courtroom, and now she stood handcuffed in his station like a common criminal. As another officer quickly moved to remove the handcuffs, the captain turned to the arresting officer. "In my office. Now." His voice was quiet but carried the weight of career-ending consequences. The young officer looked like he might be sick, the reality of his actions finally hitting him full force. The handcuffs came off with a soft click, and Judge Thompson rubbed her wrists gently. The room had fallen so quiet you could hear the old wall clock ticking. She straightened her suit jacket, her movements deliberate and composed. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting to see how she would react. "I'll need my belongings from my car," she said, her voice carrying the same authority it did in her courtroom. "And I have cases scheduled for today. Someone will need to contact the courthouse." The normalcy of her requests seemed to highlight the absurdity of what had just happened. The desk sergeant was already dialing the courthouse, his hands slightly shaking. "Yes, this is Central Station. We need to speak to the chief judge immediately. It's about Judge Thompson. There's been a situation." Through the station windows, news vans were already pulling up, their satellite dishes extending skyward. The videos from the coffee shop had spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Reporters were gathering outside, their cameras aimed at the station doors. Inside, officers were scrambling to make things right. Someone brought her a chair, not one of the hard plastic ones used for suspects, but the captain's own leather office chair. Another rushed to get her water. A third was already on the phone arranging for her car to be brought to the station. The arresting officer stood in the captain's office, visible through the glass walls. His shoulders were slumped as the captain gestured animatedly, his face red with anger. Other officers walked past, some shaking their heads, others looking away in second-hand embarrassment. Judge Thompson sat straight in the borrowed chair, her expression unreadable. She watched the chaos unfold around her, noting every detail with her judicial eye. This moment would have repercussions far beyond this morning, beyond this station, beyond even her own experience. She could already see the bigger picture forming. Judge Thompson, a senior officer, approached, his voice respectful but strained. "We've contacted your chambers. They're rearranging your docket, and..." He hesitated. "The chief judge is on his way here personally." The news rippled through the station, adding another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. Outside, the crowd from the coffee shop had followed them to the station, their numbers growing. They stood with their phones still recording, streaming live to various social media platforms. The story was spreading like wildfire. "Judge arrested on way to court. Wait till you see who she really is." The morning sun now streamed through the station windows, creating long shadows across the floor. Judge Thompson watched as a young black female officer stared at her with a mix of horror and recognition, perhaps seeing her own potential future career flash before her eyes, understanding how fragile progress could be. The captain emerged from his office, leaving the arresting officer inside. His face was grim as he approached Judge Thompson. "Your Honor," he began, his voice heavy with formal respect, "I don't have the words to express how deeply sorry we are for this incident." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "What can we do to make this right?" Judge Thompson stood, smoothing her suit, her grandmother's pearls catching the light once more. The station fell silent again, waiting for her response. In this moment, she held more than just the power of her position. She held the power to shape how this incident would be remembered, how it would change things, and what lessons would be learned from it. By noon, the video had gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of shares, and countless comments flooded social media platforms. The morning's events played out on screens across the country. A black female judge, professionally dressed, being handcuffed outside a coffee shop while calmly stating her identity. The imagery was powerful, the implications unmistakable. Inside her chambers at the courthouse, Judge Thompson sat at her desk, looking at the growing stack of messages and calls that had accumulated in just a few hours. News outlets from across the country were requesting interviews. Civil rights organizations were offering support. Legal associations were demanding immediate action. Her phone buzzed again, another text from her sister. "Mom and Dad just saw the news. They're worried sick. Should I tell them you're okay?" Judge Thompson picked up the phone, then set it down again. How could she explain to her parents that their decades of warnings about being twice as good, twice as careful hadn't been enough? A gentle knock on her chamber door interrupted her thoughts. Her clerk entered, carrying yet another pile of messages. "Your Honor, the Chief Judge would like to see you when you're ready." The young clerk's eyes were red, she'd been crying. "And there are protesters gathering outside the courthouse." Judge Thompson walked to her window. Sure enough, a crowd had formed on the courthouse steps. Some held signs, others chanted. The media presence had grown too. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Her computer screen flashed with another email notification, this one from the police commissioner himself. The subject line read, "Urgent meeting request. Immediate action required." Below it was an email from the mayor's office, then another from the State Bar Association. The ripples were becoming waves. She turned back to her desk, where the morning's case files still sat untouched. Cases that should have been heard today, people waiting for justice, waiting for their day in court. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her own experience with injustice had disrupted the very system she'd sworn to uphold. The phone on her desk rang, the direct line that only a few people had access to. "Judge Thompson speaking," she answered, her voice steady despite the morning's events. "Your Honor, The voice belonged to the head of the local bar association, someone she'd known for years. "We're calling an emergency meeting. This incident, it's brought everything to the surface. People are demanding change, real change." As she listened to the plans being laid out, Judge Thompson watched a young law student walking past her window. The student, a young woman of color, was staring up at the protesters with a mix of worry and determination on her face. How many others like her were watching today's events unfold, wondering about their own futures in the legal system? Social media continued to explode. The hashtag Judge in Cuffs was trending nationally. People were sharing their own stories of similar experiences. The conversation was growing, evolving, touching on deeper issues that had long simmered beneath the surface. Her clerk appeared again, this time with a statement from the police department. They had placed the arresting officer on administrative leave pending investigation. His body camera footage was being reviewed. The department was promising a full inquiry into the incident and a review of their training procedures. Judge Thompson read the statement carefully, noting the formal language, the careful choice of words. As a judge, she'd seen countless similar statements. But now she was on the other side of it, both subject and observer of a system she knew intimately. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her chamber floor as another knock came at her door. This time it was a senior colleague, a judge she'd known since her early days as a lawyer. "We're all behind you," he said simply. "Whatever you want to do about this, however you want to handle it, you have our full support." She nodded, appreciating the solidarity but knowing the responsibility of this moment rested squarely on her shoulders. Her response would set a precedent, not just legally but socially. It would become part of the larger narrative about justice, race, and power in America. The protests outside had grown louder. Through her window, she could see more people joining the crowd. There were law students now and local attorneys, some still in their court attire. The signs they held spoke of systemic change, of accountability, of the long road still ahead. Her sister texted again, "The family wants to know what you're going to do." It was the question everyone was asking. What would Judge Thompson do now? How would she respond to this personal injustice while maintaining her judicial integrity? The weight of the decision pressed on her like a physical thing. She could feel her grandmother's pearls against her neck, a reminder of all those who had faced similar moments before her. But she was in a unique position. She had the power to do more than just protest. She had the authority to effect real change. As the afternoon wore on, more colleagues stopped by her chambers. Each offered support, shared outrage, asked what they could do to help. But Judge Thompson was already forming a plan. This incident wouldn't be just another viral video, another moment of outrage that faded with the next news cycle. She pulled out a legal pad and began to write. Her words were measured, deliberate, just as they were in her courtroom. This wouldn't be about revenge or personal vindication. It would be about systematic change, about using this moment to create something meaningful and lasting. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. Inside, Judge Thompson continued to write, mapping out a path forward that would transform this morning's humiliation into tomorrow's progress. The system had failed her today, but she was still part of that system. And sometimes, she knew, the best way to fix a broken system was from within. 6 months had passed since that morning outside the coffee shop. The autumn chill had given way to winter, then spring, and now the courthouse steps bloomed with fresh flowers. Judge Thompson stood at her chamber window, watching a new class of police cadets filing into the building. They were here for something that hadn't existed half a year ago, mandatory training with the judges they'd one day interact with. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Police Department announces comprehensive reform package. She smiled slightly, remembering the long hours of meetings that had led to this moment. The reforms weren't perfect, but they were a start. New training protocols, community engagement requirements, and most importantly, a complete overhaul of how officers were taught to handle routine interactions. The young officer who had arrested her that morning had become an unexpected ally in the change. After facing his own moment of reckoning, he'd chosen to become part of the solution. Now he spoke to other officers about that day, about the assumptions he'd made, about the lessons he'd learned. His honesty in admitting his mistakes had earned him a different kind of respect. "Your Honor." Her clerk appeared at the door. "They're ready for you in the training room." Judge Thompson nodded, gathering her materials. These sessions had become one of the most important parts of her week, not just teaching law enforcement about legal procedures, but building bridges of understanding. The training room was full when she entered, but not with just police cadets. Community members sat alongside officers, part of the new integrated training approach. The old way of keeping law enforcement and the community separate during training had been one of the first things to change. As she took her place at the podium, she touched her grandmother's pearls, still her daily reminder of grace under pressure. The room fell silent, all eyes focused on her. They knew her story, of course. Everyone did. But what they were about to learn went far beyond that one morning. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying the same authority it always had. "Today we're going to talk about perspective, about how the same situation can look entirely different depending on where you stand, about how understanding those different perspectives can make all the difference." The screen behind her showed clips from that morning, the coffee shop videos, the cell phone footage, the body camera recordings. But now they were teaching tools, breaking down each moment, examining the assumptions, the reactions, the points where different choices could have led to different outcomes. In the audience, she could see the mix of expressions, some uncomfortable, others thoughtful, all engaged. A young black female cadet sat up straighter when Judge Thompson spoke about maintaining dignity under pressure. An older white officer nodded slowly as she explained how quick judgments could escalate situations unnecessarily. "The system only works when we all understand our roles in it," she continued, moving from behind the podium to stand closer to her audience. "When we recognize that authority comes with responsibility, and that respect must flow in both directions." The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the badge of a police sergeant who had been skeptical of these changes at first. Now he was one of their strongest supporters, having seen how better understanding led to better policing. Outside, the city moved through its daily rhythm. People passed by the courthouse, some rushing to appointments, others lingering on the steps. None of them knew that in this room, small but significant changes were taking root. Judge Thompson clicked to the next slide. Statistics showing how complaint rates had dropped since the new training began. "These numbers tell a story," she said, "but the real story is in the daily interactions that never make the headlines. The traffic stops that end with understanding instead of escalation. The moments when both officers and civilians choose to see each other as people first." Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, probably another message from her sister. The family group chat had become a place to share victories, both big and small. Just yesterday, she'd sent them a picture of a thank you note from a young officer who said the training had changed how he approached his job. As the session wound down, hands rose for questions. They were different now from those first tense days after the incident. Less defensive, more curious. Real dialogue was happening, bridges being built one conversation at a time. "Last question," she said, nodding to a cadet in the back row. "Your Honor," he stood, respectful but direct, "how do you not feel angry when you tell this story? How did you turn it into something positive?" The room fell silent, waiting for her answer. Judge Thompson looked out at the faces before her, officers and citizens, veterans and trainees, all part of the same community. She thought about that morning, about the anger and humiliation, about the choice she'd made in its aftermath. The easy path would have been anger, she said finally. The harder path was to use this moment to create real change. And that's what justice is really about, not punishment, but progress. Not retribution, but reform. The session ended, but its effects would ripple outward, just as they had been doing for the past 6 months. As the room cleared, Judge Thompson gathered her things, ready to return to her courtroom. She had cases to hear, justice to uphold, and a system to keep improving, one day at a time. The morning sun caught her grandmother's pearls one last time as she walked back to her chambers. Outside her window, another police car drove past the courthouse. The officer inside waved, a small gesture, but one that wouldn't have happened 6 months ago. Small changes, adding up to something bigger. In her inbox, a new email waited. Another department requesting the training program. On her desk, the day's cases waited for her attention. And in her heart, the knowledge that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, when people choose to learn instead of blame, to reform instead of react, to move forward instead of hold on to anger. Justice, she had learned, wasn't just about what happened in her courtroom. Sometimes it was about what happened in moments like these, when people chose to turn a moment of injustice into a movement for change.